Dover, 1851. The cold sea air stung Eleanor Jameson's face as she stood at the edge of the harbour, clutching her shawl tightly against the wind. The horizon stretched before her, grey and endless, much like the years that had passed since she last saw her husband's ship disappear into that same vastness. 5 years of waiting, of hoping, of slowly realizing that hope was the cruelest companion of all. Mrs. Jameson called Mr. Winters, the harbour master, his voice carrying over the crash of waves. No vessels expected from the Americas today. Perhaps tomorrow would be a better day for your vigil. Eleanor offered a small smile, the kind she had perfected over the years, polite, composed, revealing nothing of the emptiness within. Thank you, Mr. Winters. I was merely taking in some air. They both knew it was a lie. Every Tuesday and Friday for 5 years, Eleanor had walked to the harbour, scanning the horizon for the silhouette of the Prosperity, her husband Michael's merchant vessel. The ritual had begun as genuine hope, transformed into stubborn determination, and finally settled into habit, a way to honour a promise made on their wedding day. I shall return with a fortune worthy of you, Michael had whispered, his blue eyes alight with ambition. As she turned to leave, Eleanor caught the pitying glances of the fishermen's wives. The widow Jameson, they called her, though she corrected them each time. She was not a widow. She was a wife without a husband, existing in a purgatory between marriage and mourning. The modest townhouse that greeted Eleanor upon her return had once belonged to Michael's parents. Now it served as both her home and her livelihood, the front parlour transformed into a modest millinery shop where she crafted ladies' hats with the skill her mother had taught her. It wasn't the life she had imagined when she married the charismatic merchant who promised her the world, but it was a life she had built with her own hands. "Any news?" asked Sarah, her young assistant, looking up from a half-finished bonnet adorned with silk flowers. "The sea keeps its secrets for another day," Eleanor replied, unwrapping her shawl and hanging it near the door. At 30 years old, Eleanor retained the beauty that had once made her the belle of Dover, though time had etched fine lines around her eyes and mouth. Her chestnut hair remained lustrous, though she wore it in a simpler style now, befitting a working woman rather than a merchant's wife. "2 orders came in while you were gone. Mrs. Peterson wants a new Sunday hat, and Lady Carrington's daughter is to be married and requires 6 matching bonnets for her bridesmaids." Eleanor's heart lifted at this news. Lady Carrington's patronage would mean not only necessary income but also potential connections to other wealthy clients. "That's wonderful, Sarah. Please tell me you accepted the commission." "Of course," Sarah replied with a grin. "I said your work is the finest in Dover, perhaps in all of Kent." "A slight exaggeration," Eleanor laughed, "but I appreciate your loyalty." As Eleanor settled at her workstation, her fingers automatically reaching for needle and thread, she allowed herself to consider her situation with the cold clarity she normally avoided. Michael had sailed away with their combined fortunes invested in cotton and spices, promising to return a wealthy man. Instead, years of silence had left her with debts, a fading reputation, and the burden of maintaining appearances in a society that valued women primarily as wives. She was not destitute, her skill with a needle had saved her from that fate, but she lived perpetually on the edge of respectability, neither fully accepted in society nor completely outcast. The daughter of a country physician who had married above her station only to be abandoned, Eleanor existed in the shadows of Dover's social hierarchy, invited to enough events to maintain appearances but never fully embraced. That night, as Eleanor prepared for bed, she stood before the small portrait of Michael that hung in her bedroom. 5 years of silent anger, grief, and finally resignation had softened her feelings toward the man who had left her with nothing but promises. "Tomorrow," she whispered to the painted face that captured none of her husband's vibrant charm, "I think I shall not go to the harbour." The declaration felt like both betrayal and liberation, a first step toward accepting what she had long suspected, Michael Jameson would never return, and she must finally begin to live as though that truth were certain. The following morning brought an unexpected visitor to Eleanor's shop. The bell above the door chimed as she was arranging a display of her newest creations, and she turned to find a gentleman unlike any who typically entered her establishment. He stood well over 6 feet tall, his posture military straight, his clothing exquisitely tailored in a way that spoke of London's finest shops rather than Dover's modest offerings. Dark hair, touched with distinguished grey at the temples, framed a face that seemed carved from granite, handsome, but severe, with eyes so deeply blue they appeared almost black in the shop's dim light. "Mrs. Jameson." His voice was deep, cultured, the accent unmistakably aristocratic. Eleanor straightened, suddenly conscious of her work apron and the pins held between her lips. Removing them quickly, she offered a small curtsy. "Yes, sir. How may I help you?" "I am Nicholas Zimmerman, the Duke of Westmoreland." He paused, as though expecting the title to provoke a reaction. When Eleanor merely nodded, something like approval flickered across his stern features. "I would like to speak with you on a matter of some delicacy. Is there perhaps a more private setting where we might converse?" Eleanor hesitated. Propriety dictated she should not be alone with an unknown gentleman, duke or not. Yet curiosity, and something else she couldn't name, made her gesture toward the small sitting room behind the shop. "Sarah," she called to her assistant, who had been staring open-mouthed at the Duke since his entrance, "please mind the shop for a moment." The sitting room was modest but well-kept, furnished with the few quality pieces that remained from better days. Eleanor indicated a chair for the Duke and took the seat opposite, her back straight, hands folded in her lap. "Your Grace," she began, "I must confess I'm puzzled by your visit. I don't believe we've had the pleasure of meeting before." The Duke removed his gloves methodically, his movements deliberate. "We have not, Mrs. Jameson, but I am well acquainted with your husband." Eleanor's heart stuttered. "You know Michael? Have you news of him?" The questions tumbled out before she could master herself, and she immediately regretted the display of vulnerability. "I knew Michael Jameson, yes." His use of the past tense did not escape her notice. "I've come to Dover on business and felt it my duty to call upon you. Your husband and I had dealings in the West Indies some years ago." "Then he is dead." Eleanor made it a statement, not a question. 5 years of uncertainty crystallized into cold certainty. The Duke's expression softened slightly. "I believe so, yes." His ship, the Prosperity, was lost in a hurricane off Barbados in 1847. There were no survivors reported. For years. Michael had been dead for 4 years while she maintained her vigils at the harbor, defending her status as a wife rather than a widow, clinging to the fiction that he might still return. "I see." Eleanor was surprised by the steadiness of her own voice. "Thank you for bringing me this news, Your Grace. It is a kindness to know the truth at last." "There is more, Mrs. Jameson." The Duke leaned forward slightly. "Before his final voyage, your husband entrusted certain documents to my care, documents that pertain to your financial situation." Hope flared briefly. Had Michael somehow secured their future after all? "I'm afraid the news is not favorable," the Duke continued, dampening that hope before it could take root. "Your husband borrowed extensively against your property here in Dover. The loans were due to be repaid last year. The lenders have been patient, given your uncertain circumstances, but now that your husband's fate is confirmed, they will demand payment," Eleanor finished for him. "And I have nothing with which to pay. That is the unfortunate truth of the matter." Eleanor stood and walked to the window, needing a moment to compose herself. Beyond the glass, Dover continued its daily business, oblivious to the fact that her world was collapsing for the second time in 5 years. May I ask why you've taken a personal interest in my affairs, Your Grace? Surely a duke has more pressing concerns than the financial troubles of a merchant's widow. When she turned back to face him, the duke was watching her with an intensity that made her uncomfortably aware of her simple dress and work-roughened hands. "I made a promise to your husband," he said finally. "He saved my life during a violent storm at sea, at considerable risk to his own. Before we parted ways, I swore that should anything happen to him, I would ensure his wife did not suffer for it." "A noble sentiment," Eleanor replied, unable to keep a hint of bitterness from her voice. "Though I've been suffering the consequences of his absence for years already." "Indeed?" The duke stood, his height seeming to fill the small room. "Which is why I've taken the liberty of settling your husband's debts." Eleanor stared at him, certain she had misheard. "You've done what?" "The mortgages on this property have been paid in full." "You own this house outright now, Mrs. Jameson?" "That's impossible. The debt must be substantial." "I cannot accept such charity, Your Grace, nor can I possibly repay you." "It is not charity," he said firmly. "It is the fulfillment of a debt of honor. I do not expect repayment." Eleanor shook her head, overwhelmed. "Why would you do this for a stranger?" "Because a man's word must mean something in this world," the Duke replied simply. "Michael Jameson saved my life. The least I can do is preserve his widow's home." "I'm not sure whether to thank you or to be offended by your presumption," Eleanor said honestly. Something like amusement flickered in the Duke's severe expression. "Either response would be understandable, Mrs. Jameson. However, there is one condition to my assistance." "Of course there would be." Eleanor tensed, suddenly wary. "And what might that be, Your Grace?" "My sister, Lady Caroline, is to be married in London next month. She requires a trousseau of hats and bonnets befitting her station. I'm told your work is exceptional. I would commission you to create them." It was so unexpected that Eleanor nearly laughed. "You've settled my debts in exchange for millinery work." "I've settled your debts because it was the right thing to do," he corrected. "The commission is separate, a legitimate business transaction that will allow you to maintain your pride while also introducing your work to London society." Eleanor studied him, trying to discern his true motives. Men, in her experience, rarely acted without self-interest, particularly men of power. Yet there was something in the Duke's direct gaze that suggested genuine honor. "Very well," she said finally. "I accept your commission, Your Grace. And I thank you for the kindness you've shown me today, unexpected though it may be." The Duke nodded once, satisfied. "Excellent. My carriage will collect you and your materials next Wednesday. I've taken rooms at the Ship Hotel for the duration of my business in Dover. We can discuss the details of my sister's requirements there." "Collect me?" Eleanor echoed, confused. "Surely you don't expect me to travel to London?" "Indeed I do, Mrs. Jameson. My sister will require multiple fittings, and there are social events where your presence will be necessary to observe the latest fashions. I've arranged accommodations for you at my London residence, where you'll have a proper workspace and access to materials far superior to what Dover can offer." Eleanor's mind reeled at the implications. "But Your Grace, I cannot simply abandon my business here. And a single woman staying in a bachelor's home, it would be most improper. My aunt, Lady Agatha, serves as my hostess. Her presence ensures all propriety will be maintained." His tone brooked no argument. "As for your business, surely your assistant can manage for a few weeks? The compensation I'm offering should more than offset any lost local custom." Put that way, Eleanor could hardly refuse. The opportunity to establish connections with London's elite could transform her modest business into something far more secure. Very well, she agreed cautiously. I shall be ready on Wednesday. As the Duke took his leave, Eleanor remained in the sitting room, her thoughts in turmoil. In the space of an hour, she had learned her husband was truly dead, her financial security was assured, and she was somehow bound for London under the patronage of a duke whose motives remained unclear. For the first time in 5 years, Eleanor Jameson's future was not an endless repetition of the present, and the sensation was as terrifying as it was exhilarating. The journey to London passed in relative silence. Eleanor sat across from the Duke in his luxurious carriage, her sample case of ribbons and trimmings beside her, her modest trunk strapped to the rear. She had spent the days since his visit in a flurry of preparation, instructing Sarah on managing the shop, completing outstanding orders, and attempting to assemble a wardrobe suitable for London. The latter had proved the most challenging. Eleanor had long ago sold or refashioned her finer gowns, keeping only what was practical for her diminished circumstances. What remained was respectable but plain, the wardrobe of a working tradeswoman, not someone who would be creating hats for the sister of a duke. As if sensing her thoughts, the Duke spoke. I've taken the liberty of arranging for a dressmaker to call upon you tomorrow morning. Lady Caroline has similar measurements to yours, I believe. Some of her gowns from last season should suffice until new ones can be made. Eleanor stiffened. That's unnecessary, Your Grace. My clothing is perfectly adequate for my station. Your station, for the coming weeks, will be that of an honored artisan in an aristocratic household, he replied evenly. The clothing is a business expense, nothing more. My sister's friends must believe her milliner is of the highest caliber, which requires a certain presentation. Put that way, it was hard to argue without appearing prideful or ungrateful. Still, Eleanor couldn't help but feel that with each gesture, the Duke was binding her to him in ways that made her uncomfortable. You're very thorough in your planning, Your Grace, she observed. Nicholas, he said suddenly. When we're not in formal company, I'd prefer you use my given name. Eleanor raised an eyebrow. That would hardly be appropriate. Nor would it be appropriate for me to call you Eleanor, yet I intend to do so. We shall be spending considerable time together over the coming weeks. Excessive formality will only create unnecessary distance. Perhaps distance is preferable, under the circumstances, Eleanor replied carefully. Something like amusement flickered in his eyes. Are you afraid of me, Mrs. Jameson? Not afraid, she corrected. Cautious. I know little about you beyond your title and your apparent sense of obligation to my late husband. A reasonable position. He nodded approvingly. Very well. What would you like to know? The direct question caught Eleanor off guard. She considered for a moment, then asked, How did you come to be on a merchant vessel in the West Indies? It seems an unlikely place for a duke. I wasn't always a duke, he replied, gazing out the window at the passing countryside. The title came to me only 3 years ago, upon my cousin's death. Before that, I was merely Lord Nicholas Zimmerman, a second son with a commission in Her Majesty's Navy. I was returning from a diplomatic assignment in Jamaica when our ship encountered the storm that nearly claimed my life. And that's when you met Michael. The name still brought a pang, but a duller one now. Yes. The prosperity came upon our foundering vessel. Most captains would have kept their distance, it was a terrible storm, but your husband ordered his men to assist. He personally pulled me from the water when I was washed overboard during the rescue operation. Eleanor could picture it clearly. Michael had always been impulsively heroic, more concerned with glory than caution. It was part of what had attracted her to him, that boldness so different from her own careful nature. That sounds like him, she said softly. always ready to leap without looking. Nicholas studied her. You speak of him with both affection and exasperation. Marriage is complex, Your Grace, Nicholas, she amended, testing the name. More so when it ends with abandonment rather than closure. You believed he abandoned you willingly. There was no judgment in his tone, merely curiosity. Eleanor sighed. I never knew what to believe. Michael was ambitious, always chasing the next opportunity, convinced that true fortune was just one more voyage away. When years passed without word, I wondered if perhaps he'd found success somewhere and chosen not to return. A painful uncertainty to live with. His words were simple but held genuine understanding. Yes. Eleanor turned to look out her own window, unwilling to reveal more of her private pain. But that chapter is closed now. I know the truth, however difficult it may be. The remainder of the journey passed in more comfortable conversation, with Nicholas explaining the details of his sister's upcoming nuptials and Eleanor describing the latest millinery fashions from Paris. By the time they reached London, Eleanor found herself less wary of the Duke, though no less confused by his interest in her welfare. Nicholas's London residence proved to be a magnificent townhouse in Mayfair, its imposing facade speaking of generations of wealth and privilege. Eleanor felt distinctly out of place as footmen rushed to open the carriage door and take her meagre belongings. Welcome to Zimmerman House, Nicholas said, offering his hand to help her descend from the carriage. The touch of his gloved fingers against hers sent an unexpected warmth through Eleanor's body, a sensation so foreign that she nearly stumbled on the carriage step. If Nicholas noticed her momentary discomposure, he gave no sign of it, merely guiding her up the steps to where an elderly woman waited in the doorway. Aunt Agatha, may I present Mrs. Eleanor Jameson? Eleanor, my aunt, Lady Agatha Zimmerman. The woman was diminutive but held herself with such regal bearing that she seemed to look down at Eleanor despite being several inches shorter. Sharp eyes in a face lined with experience assessed Eleanor thoroughly before a smile softened her features. So you're the milliner Nicholas has been so mysterious about. Come in, my dear. You must be exhausted from your journey. Eleanor was shown to a suite of rooms more luxurious than any she had occupied since before her marriage. A sitting room, bedchamber, and a smaller room that had been arranged as a workspace awaited her, along with a lady's maid assigned to attend her during her stay. This is far too grand, she protested when Nicholas accompanied her on a tour of the accommodations. Nonsense. This is the Blue Suite, where we typically house visiting female relatives. It's been standing empty for months. He gestured to the workspace where bolts of ribbon, feathers, and other millinery supplies had been arranged. I had these brought in based on what my secretary could discover about current fashions. If anything is missing, you need only say the word. Eleanor moved to the table, running her fingers over the exquisite materials, silks from China, ribbons from France, feathers that must have cost a small fortune. This is extraordinary, she breathed, momentarily forgetting her reservations in the face of such bounty. When she looked up, Nicholas was watching her with an expression she couldn't quite interpret, something between satisfaction and an emotion far more complex. I shall leave you to settle in, he said, his deep voice uncharacteristically gentle. Dinner is served at 7. Aunt Agatha will send a maid to escort you to the drawing-room beforehand. After he departed, Eleanor sank onto a delicate chair, overwhelmed by the dramatic change in her circumstances. Just days ago, she had been a shopkeeper in Dover, living in the shadow of her husband's disappearance. Now she was installed in a Duke's London mansion, surrounded by luxury, with the prospect of establishing connections that could secure her future. It was too much, too fast, and despite the undeniable opportunity it presented, Eleanor couldn't shake the sensation that she was being maneuvered by forces beyond her understanding, chief among them the enigmatic Duke whose motives remained opaque. Dinner that evening proved less intimidating than Eleanor had anticipated. Only Nicholas, Lady Agatha, and herself were present in the vast dining room, seated at one end of a table that could easily accommodate 20. The conversation flowed easily, with Lady Agatha proving unexpectedly knowledgeable about fashion and eager to hear Eleanor's opinions on the latest styles from Paris. "Tomorrow you'll meet Caroline," Nicholas said as they enjoyed a dessert of poached pears. "She's staying with her fiancé's family until the wedding, but she'll call in the morning to discuss her requirements." "I look forward to it," Eleanor replied, already mentally cataloguing designs that might suit a young aristocrat's trousseau. "May I ask about the gentleman she's to marry?" Lady Agatha snorted delicately. "Lord Penfield is exactly what one would expect, wealthy, well-connected, and utterly dull. But Caroline seems fond of him, and at 24, she can't afford to be too selective." "Aunt," Nicholas admonished, though his tone held more amusement than censure. "Oh, don't aunt me, Nicholas. Mrs. Jameson is a woman of the world. She understands the marriage market better than most, I'd wager." Lady Agatha turned shrewd eyes to Eleanor. "How old were you when you married, my dear?" 18, Eleanor admitted. "Perhaps too young to make such a significant decision. And was it a love match?" The directness of the question would have been shocking in most drawing rooms, but Lady Agatha's advanced age seemed to excuse her from normal social constraints. "I believed it was," Eleanor answered honestly. "Though in retrospect, I think Michael was more in love with the idea of adventure than with me." Nicholas's gaze sharpened. "You do yourself a disservice. Any man would be fortunate to call you wife." The unexpected compliment brought warmth to Eleanor's cheeks. "You're kind to say so, Your Grace." "Nicholas," he corrected gently. "Nicholas," she echoed, the name still feeling strange on her lips. Lady Agatha glanced between them with poorly concealed interest. "Well, this has been delightful, but I find I'm quite fatigued. If you'll excuse me, I think I shall retire for the evening." After the elderly lady's departure, an awkward silence descended on the dining room. Eleanor was acutely aware that she was alone with Nicholas, a situation that would have been scandalous had anyone outside the household known of it. "Perhaps I should retire as well," she suggested, rising from her seat. Nicholas stood immediately. "Of course. However, I wondered if you might join me in the library first. There are some papers regarding your husband's affairs that you should review." Curiosity overcame propriety, and Eleanor found herself following Nicholas through the grand house to a magnificent library lined with thousands of volumes. A fire burned cheerfully in the grate, casting the room in a warm, golden light that softened its masculine furnishings. Nicholas went to a large desk and withdrew a folder of documents. "These are the papers related to your property in Dover. The deed is now solely in your name. You should keep them safe." Eleanor accepted the folder, her fingers brushing against his in the exchange. The contact, brief as it was, sent another of those disconcerting flashes of warmth through her body. "Thank you," she murmured, stepping back to put distance between them. "Your generosity continues to overwhelm me." "It's not generosity," he said firmly. "It's justice. Your husband's death left you vulnerable to creditors who would have claimed what was rightfully yours. Even so, most men would not have intervened as you have." Eleanor studied him in the firelight, trying to reconcile this honorable, intense man with the distant aristocrat she had initially perceived. "You're not what I expected, Nicholas." "And what did you expect?" There was genuine curiosity in his voice. "Someone more remote. More concerned with propriety and station than with the welfare of a merchant's widow." Nicholas moved to pour 2 glasses of brandy from a decanter, offering one to Eleanor. She hesitated, then accepted it, another small transgression in a day filled with them. "I've spent most of my life at sea," he said, leaning against the mantelpiece. Naval discipline is rigid, but it's based on merit and ability, not birth. A captain must care for every man under his command, regardless of their background. Those values don't disappear simply because one inherits a title. You didn't want the dukedom, Eleanor guessed, sipping the fiery liquid. No, he admitted. I was content with my naval career. But duty is not a matter of preference. Duty, Eleanor echoed thoughtfully. Is that what I am to you? A duty? Nicholas's blue eyes locked with hers, intense and unreadable in the firelight. Initially, perhaps. But now. He paused, seeming to reconsider his words. Now I find myself genuinely concerned for your welfare, beyond any obligation to your husband's memory. The admission hung between them, charged with unspoken implications. Eleanor found herself unable to look away from his gaze, caught in a moment that seemed suspended outside the normal flow of time. The clock on the mantel chimed 10, breaking the spell. Eleanor set down her barely touched brandy with fingers that trembled slightly. It's late, she said, gathering the folder of documents. I should prepare for tomorrow's meeting with your sister. Nicholas straightened, his expression once again the composed mask of aristocratic reserve. Of course. Jenkins will escort you to your rooms. As if summoned by his master's thought, a butler appeared at the library door. Eleanor cursed, a gesture Nicholas acknowledged with a formal bow. Good night, Eleanor. I trust you'll sleep well. Good night, Nicholas. And thank you again, for everything. As she followed the butler through the quiet house, Eleanor couldn't shake the sensation that something fundamental had shifted between herself and the Duke, something that both thrilled and terrified her in equal measure. The following weeks passed in a whirlwind of activity. Lady Caroline proved to be a charming, if somewhat flighty, young woman with decided opinions about her bridal trousseau. Eleanor found herself creating not only the 6 bonnets originally commissioned but an entire collection of headwear for every possible occasion, morning calls, afternoon rides, evening soirees, and of course, the elaborate creation that would complement the wedding gown. With each fitting and consultation, Eleanor's confidence grew. The aristocratic ladies who called upon Lady Caroline expressed admiration for her work, several commissioning pieces of their own. What had begun as a single commission was rapidly expanding into connections that could transform her modest Dover business into something far more prestigious. Throughout it all, Nicholas remained a constant, enigmatic presence. He was unfailingly courteous, even warm during their daily encounters, yet Eleanor sensed he was holding something back, watching her with those intense blue eyes when he thought she wouldn't notice, finding reasons to seek her company that went beyond the requirements of hospitality. 3 weeks into her stay, as Eleanor was putting the finishing touches on Lady Caroline's wedding bonnet, a commotion in the entrance hall drew her attention. Curious, she set aside her work and moved to the door of her workroom, which opened onto a gallery overlooking the main staircase. Nicholas stood in the hall below, his tall figure rigid with barely contained anger as he confronted a man Eleanor had never seen before. The stranger was fashionably dressed but had the disheveled appearance of someone who had been traveling hard. His voice, when he spoke, carried clearly to where Eleanor stood. Come now, Westmoreland, you can't keep her hidden away forever. I have a right to see her. You have no rights whatsoever, Nicholas replied, his voice cold as ice. I made the situation perfectly clear in my letter. The matter is resolved. Resolved to your satisfaction, perhaps, the stranger countered. But I'm not so easily dismissed. I want to hear it from her own lips. That won't be possible. Mrs. Jameson is engaged with preparations for my sister's wedding. She has no time for unwelcome visitors. Eleanor froze at the mention of her name. What business could this man possibly have with her? The stranger laughed, an unpleasant sound devoid of humor. "Mrs. Jameson, is it? Still clinging to that fiction? How charmingly loyal." Nicholas stepped closer to the man, his voice dropping to a dangerous pitch. "Choose your next words with extreme care, Raleigh. You're already treading on thin ice." The name struck Eleanor like a physical blow. Raleigh. The Raleighs had been Michael's business partners, financing his final voyage in exchange for a share of the anticipated profits. After his disappearance, they had been among the most aggressive of her creditors. Unable to contain her curiosity, Eleanor descended the stairs, her presence immediately drawing the attention of both men. "Mrs. Jameson," Nicholas said, his expression tightening. "I apologize for the disturbance. Mr. Raleigh was just leaving." "Actually," Eleanor replied calmly, "I believe Mr. Raleigh may have business with me." "Is that correct, sir?" The man, younger than she had expected, perhaps 30, offered a bow that bordered on insolent. "Indeed it is, madam. Thomas Raleigh, at your service. I've spent considerable time and resources attempting to locate you after your sudden departure from Dover." "I left my assistant in charge of the shop," Eleanor said, puzzled. Any business matters could have been addressed through her. "This is hardly a matter for shop girls," Raleigh replied with a dismissive wave. "It concerns your husband." Eleanor's heart quickened. "Michael? What about him?" Nicholas stepped forward. "Eleanor, there's no need to engage with this gentleman. I've already addressed his claims." "Claims?" she repeated, looking between the two men. "What claims?" Raleigh smiled, the expression failing to reach his eyes. "Only that your husband isn't quite as dead as the Duke would have you believe. In fact, he was very much alive when I saw him in Barbados 6 months ago." The world seemed to tilt beneath Eleanor's feet. She reached for the banister to steady herself, her mind refusing to process what she'd just heard. "That's impossible," she whispered. "The Prosperity was lost in a hurricane. There were no survivors." "The ship was lost, yes," Raleigh conceded. "But your husband wasn't aboard when it sank. He'd already sold the cargo and pocketed the proceeds, leaving his crew to their fate while he established himself in the Indies under a new name." Nicholas's hand closed around Raleigh's arm with such force that the younger man winced. "You've said enough. Get out before I have you thrown out." "Is it true?" Eleanor asked Nicholas, her voice hardly more than a whisper. "Did you know Michael might be alive?" The momentary hesitation in Nicholas's expression was answer enough. Eleanor felt as though the ground had opened beneath her, swallowing all certainty, all the tentative peace she had found in recent weeks. "I think," she said, fighting to keep her voice steady, "that both of you owe me an explanation. Now." Lady Agatha, drawn by the commotion, appeared at the top of the stairs. Taking in the tableau below, she descended with remarkable speed for her years. "Whatever this is about," she declared, "it should not be discussed in the entrance hall like some common domestic dispute. To the library, all of you." The authority in her voice brooked no argument. Even Raleigh, who had the look of a man unaccustomed to following orders, complied without protest. Once they were settled in the library, Eleanor and Lady Agatha seated, Nicholas standing by the fireplace, Raleigh lounging with affected casualness in an armchair, the elderly lady took charge. "Now, Mr. Raleigh, you will explain yourself clearly and concisely. What evidence do you have regarding Mr. Jameson's survival?" Raleigh reached into his coat and withdrew a folded document. "A partnership agreement, signed by Michael Jameson, or Michael James, as he now calls himself, dated December of last year. We've entered into a new venture, importing sugar from plantations he's acquired in Barbados." Eleanor accepted the paper with trembling hands, her eyes immediately recognizing the bold, slashing signature that had once signed love letters to her. There was no mistake, Michael had written this. "He's alive," she said numbly. "All this time, he's been alive. And prospering," Raleigh added with a smirk. "Though he seems to have forgotten certain obligations back home." Nicholas's voice cut through the room, cold as steel. "What exactly do you want, Raleigh? Money? Because if so, name your price and be done with it." "I'm a businessman, not a blackmailer," Raleigh protested, though his expression suggested the distinction was largely semantic. "I merely thought Mrs. Jameson should know the truth about her husband before entering into any new arrangements." His meaningful glance between Eleanor and Nicholas made his insinuation clear. Eleanor felt heat rise to her cheeks, partly from embarrassment, partly from anger at being the subject of such speculation. "If my husband is alive, then I am still legally married," she said, her voice steadier than she felt. "There are no arrangements, new or otherwise, to consider." Nicholas's jaw tightened, but he remained silent, his eyes fixed on some point above the fireplace. "How convenient that you should discover this information just as the Duke has settled all of Michael's debts," Eleanor continued, turning to Raleigh. "One might almost suspect the timing was deliberate." Raleigh shrugged, unrepentant. "Business is about recognizing opportunities, Mrs. Jameson. Your husband taught me that." "Get out," Nicholas said quietly, his controlled tone more frightening than any shouted command could have been. "You've delivered your message. Now leave, before I forget I'm a gentleman." Raleigh rose, straightening his coat with exaggerated care. "As you wish, Your Grace. But this matter isn't concluded. If Mrs. Jameson wishes to contact her wayward husband, she can reach him through my offices in London." He placed a card on the table before bowing with mock deference. "Good day, ladies." "Your Grace." After he departed, silence hung heavy in the library. Eleanor sat motionless, the document still clutched in her hands, her mind a storm of conflicting emotions, shock, anger, betrayal, and beneath it all, a strange sense of vindication. She hadn't been abandoned. Michael hadn't chosen to leave her? He had simply chosen not to return. "You knew," she said finally, looking up at Nicholas. "You knew he might be alive, yet you told me he was dead." "I believed he was dead," Nicholas replied, his voice tight. "The reports of the Prosperity's loss were well documented. It wasn't until 3 months ago, when I began investigating your husband's debts, that I encountered rumors suggesting otherwise. Rumors you chose not to share with me." "I was trying to protect you," he said, meeting her eyes directly. "The man described to me a plantation owner living under a false name, who spoke of England as a place he'd gladly left behind. That man had chosen to abandon you, Eleanor. I thought the truth of his death would be easier to bear than the truth of his betrayal." "That wasn't your decision to make." Eleanor rose, her legs unsteady but her resolve firm. "You had no right to decide what truths I could or couldn't handle. No right at all." Lady Agatha, who had observed the exchange in silence, now spoke. "Nicholas has always suffered from an excess of honor, my dear. It's a family failing. He meant well, though his methods were questionable." "Meaning well doesn't excuse deception," Eleanor replied, moving toward the door. "I need time to think. To process what I've learned." Nicholas made as if to follow her, then stopped himself. "Eleanor, not now," she interrupted, unable to bear whatever explanation or justification he might offer. "Please, just not now." As she fled to the sanctuary of her rooms, Eleanor felt as though her life had been upended once again, just when she had begun to find her footing, to imagine a future beyond mere survival. Michael was alive. The man she had mourned, resented, and finally begun to release from her heart was living a new life across the ocean, while she had remained trapped in the purgatory of their marriage. And Nicholas, who had seemed a paragon of honesty and honor, had kept this vital truth from her, making decisions about her life as though she were a child to be protected rather than a woman with the right to determine her own path. Eleanor sank onto her bed, finally allowing the tears she had held back in the library to fall freely. They were not tears of grief for a husband lost, but of anger for years wasted, of humiliation at being the last to know the truth of her own marriage. When the tears finally subsided, Eleanor rose and moved to the window, gazing out at the London streets below. One thought emerged with perfect clarity from the chaos of her emotions: she would no longer allow men to determine her fate. Not Michael, who had abandoned her for a new life. Not Raleigh, who saw her as a pawn in some financial game. And not Nicholas, who, despite his kindness, had denied her agency in matters that affected her most deeply. Whatever came next, the decision would be hers alone. For 3 days, Eleanor remained largely confined to her rooms, emerging only for meals where conversation was stilted and formal. She worked feverishly on Lady Caroline's wedding attire, channeling her turbulent emotions into creative energy that resulted in her finest work to date. Nicholas respected her desire for distance, though she occasionally caught him watching her with an expression of such regret that it made her heart constrict despite her anger. On the 4th day, as Eleanor was delivering the completed wedding bonnet to Lady Caroline's chambers, Nicholas intercepted her in the corridor. "Eleanor," he said, his voice low and urgent. "Please, may I speak with you? Properly, not in passing like this." She hesitated, then nodded reluctantly. "This evening, in the library. After dinner." The hours until their appointed meeting stretched endlessly. Eleanor changed her gown twice, unsure why she suddenly cared about her appearance for what would likely be an uncomfortable conversation. When she finally entered the library, she found Nicholas standing by the window, his tall figure silhouetted against the evening sky. "Thank you for coming," he said, turning to face her. In the lamplight, she could see the strain of recent days etched on his features. "You said you wanted to speak properly," Eleanor replied, remaining near the door. "I'm listening." Nicholas drew a deep breath, as though gathering courage. "I've written to Barbados, seeking confirmation of Raleigh's claims. It will take weeks for a response, but I wanted you to know I'm pursuing the truth." "I appreciate that," she said cautiously. "But that's not why I asked to speak with you." He took a step toward her, then stopped, seeming to think better of it. "I wanted to apologize. Not just for withholding information about your husband, but for presuming to make decisions on your behalf. It was wrong of me." The simple admission, delivered without qualification or excuse, caught Eleanor off guard. She had expected justifications, perhaps even condescension, but not this forthright acknowledgement. "Why did you do it?" she asked, needing to understand. Nicholas ran a hand through his hair, a rare gesture of discomposure from a man usually so controlled. "When I first sought you out in Dover, it was purely out of obligation to your husband's memory. But from the moment I met you, your dignity despite your circumstances, your independence, your clear-eyed assessment of your situation, I found myself drawn to you in a way I hadn't anticipated." "So you lied to me because you were attracted to me?" Eleanor couldn't keep the incredulity from her voice. "No," he said firmly. "I withheld information because I feared it would cause you pain, and because—" He paused, visibly struggling with words that didn't come easily to him. "Because I hoped, selfishly, that if you believed yourself widowed, you might eventually consider a different future. One that included me." The admission hung in the air between them, its implication staggering. Eleanor sank into a nearby chair, her legs suddenly unsteady. "You barely knew me," she said softly. "I knew enough," Nicholas replied, his voice equally quiet. I knew you were strong, principled, and unafraid of hard work. I knew you had endured abandonment with grace and built a life from the ruins of your expectations. Those are rare qualities, Eleanor, in any woman of any station. And now, she asked, meeting his gaze directly. Now that we know Michael may be alive, what future do you envision? Nicholas moved to stand before her, close enough that she could see the flecks of grey in his blue eyes. That depends entirely on what you want, Eleanor. If you wish to return to Dover and continue as before, I'll ensure you have the means to do so comfortably. If you wish to seek out your husband, I'll help you arrange passage to Barbados. And if I wish for neither of those options? The question emerged almost of its own accord, giving voice to thoughts Eleanor had scarcely allowed herself to acknowledge. A flash of something like hope crossed Nicholas's features. Then we would need to discover what you do want, and determine if it's something I can help provide. Eleanor stood, needing to move, to put physical distance between herself and Nicholas while she sorted through her confused emotions. Even if Michael is alive, he clearly has no intention of returning to England or to me. He's built a new life, a new identity. Which may mean your marriage could be annulled on grounds of desertion, Nicholas said carefully. If that were something you desired. The possibility hadn't occurred to Eleanor. Freedom, a legal, recognized freedom, had seemed impossible as long as Michael's fate remained unknown. But if he could be proven alive, living under another name. I need time, she said, overwhelmed by the implications. This is all happening so quickly. 3 weeks ago, I was a shopkeeper in Dover, living in the shadow of uncertainty. Now I'm in London, designing hats for aristocrats, discovering my husband may be alive but living as another man, and you're suggesting. She trailed off, unable to articulate exactly what Nicholas was proposing. I'm suggesting nothing, he replied gently. I'm merely acknowledging possibilities. The decisions, all of them, must be yours, Eleanor. I won't make the mistake of presumption again. Eleanor studied him, trying to reconcile the austere Duke who had first appeared in her shop with this man who stood before her now, vulnerable and uncertain despite his power and position. Why me? She asked finally. You could have any woman in London society. Why would you concern yourself with a merchant's abandoned wife? Nicholas's smile was tinged with sadness. Because those women see the Duke, not the man. They want the title, the wealth, the position at court. You've never once shown deference to my rank. You challenge me, question me, hold me accountable. Do you have any idea how rare that is in my world? The raw honesty in his voice touched something deep within Eleanor, breaking through the protective walls she had built around her heart since Michael's disappearance. I should go, she said, suddenly afraid of the emotions threatening to overwhelm her. It's late, and Lady Caroline's final fitting is tomorrow. Nicholas nodded, accepting her retreat without protest. Of course. But Eleanor, he caught her hand as she moved to pass him, the contact sending that now familiar warmth through her body. Whatever you decide, know that my respect and admiration for you will not change. Eleanor slipped her hand from his, unable to trust herself with continued contact. Good night, Nicholas. As she made her way back to her rooms, Eleanor's mind whirled with conflicting thoughts and emotions. For 5 years, she had defined herself as Michael Jameson's abandoned wife, clinging to the legal and social identity of marriage even as she built an independent life. The possibility of freedom, true freedom, to choose her own path without the shadow of the past, was as terrifying as it was exhilarating. And Nicholas? The feelings he stirred in her were unlike anything she had experienced with Michael. Her youthful love for her husband had been built on romantic notions and dreams of adventure. What she felt for Nicholas was deeper, more complex, a recognition of shared values, mutual respect, and yes, a physical attraction that grew more difficult to deny with each passing day. That night, as Eleanor lay awake in her luxurious bed, she finally allowed herself to imagine a future different from any she had previously considered, not as a shopkeeper in Dover, not as the returned wife of a prodigal husband, but as a woman free to make choices based on her own desires rather than the expectations of others. The thought was simultaneously liberating and terrifying, a glimpse of possibilities that had seemed beyond reach just weeks before. Lady Caroline's wedding day dawned bright and clear, a perfect June morning that seemed designed to complement the elaborate celebrations planned. Eleanor had risen early, personally delivering the bridal ensemble to Penfield House where the ceremony would take place. She had intended to return to Zimmerman House immediately afterward, having declined the invitation to attend the ceremony itself. Such an event was far beyond her social standing, and she had no wish to create awkwardness for Nicholas or his family. Yet as her hired carriage approached the Duke's residence, Eleanor directed the driver to continue on to a different destination, the offices of Thomas Raleigh, whose card she had retrieved from the library after that confrontational meeting. The establishment was modest but respectable, situated in a commercial district that catered to shipping interests. A clerk showed her into a plain office where Raleigh sat behind a desk cluttered with manifests and account books. "Mrs. Jameson," he said, rising with evident surprise. "I hadn't expected a personal visit." "I prefer to conduct important business face-to-face, Mr. Raleigh," Eleanor replied, remaining standing even when he gestured to a chair. "I want to know exactly what my husband is doing in Barbados, and I want the truth, not whatever version serves your financial interests." Raleigh studied her for a moment, then gave a short laugh. "Direct and to the point. I can see why Westmoreland is so taken with you." Eleanor ignored the insinuation. "Michael. Tell me about him." "As I said before, he calls himself Michael James now. After the Prosperity was damaged in the hurricane, he took the opportunity to reinvent himself. The ship eventually sank, but he had already removed most of the valuable cargo and established himself ashore." "And the crew?" Eleanor asked, dreading the answer. Raleigh shrugged. "Some survived, some didn't. Your husband wasn't particularly concerned with their fate once he had what he wanted." The callousness described was so at odds with the Michael she had known, or thought she had known, that Eleanor found it difficult to reconcile. Had he always been capable of such selfishness, and she had simply been too naive to see it? "How did you find him?" she pressed. "Pure chance. I was in Barbados on business and overheard a plantation owner being addressed as Mr. James. There was something familiar about him, so I made inquiries. Once I confirmed his identity, I approached him directly. He was displeased to be discovered, but saw the advantage in a partnership with someone who had connections in London. And he never once asked about me. About his home in Dover." Something like pity flickered in Raleigh's eyes. "No, Mrs. Jameson. He was quite clear that his life in England was behind him. He's remarried, you see. A widow with a small plantation. That's the foundation of his current prosperity." The news should have been devastating, but Eleanor found herself feeling strangely detached, as though Raleigh were describing a stranger rather than the man she had pledged to love until death. "Bigamy," she said quietly. "He's committed a crime." "One of several," Raleigh agreed. "Though proving it would require bringing him back to England, which I doubt he'd submit to willingly." Eleanor straightened her shoulders. "Mr. Raleigh, I have a proposition for you. One that could benefit us both substantially." Raleigh leaned forward, instantly alert to the scent of potential profit. "I'm listening." "I want documented proof of my husband's survival and his new marriage. Affidavits, witness statements, anything that would stand up in an English court." "In exchange?" She paused, gathering her courage. In exchange, I will relinquish any claim to his assets in Barbados. You can tell him he's free of me, legally and financially, once I have what I need. And what exactly do you need these documents for, Mrs. Jameson? To secure an annulment, she said firmly. On grounds of desertion and bigamy. Raleigh's smile was calculating. The Duke must be very persuasive indeed. This has nothing to do with the Duke, Eleanor replied coldly. This is about my freedom, my right to determine my own future without living in the shadow of abandonment. Of course, Raleigh said, not bothering to hide his skepticism. Well, Mrs. Jameson, you have yourself a deal. I return to Barbados next month. I should have your documentation within 12 weeks. 8. Eleanor countered. I'm willing to pay for expediency. You can pay? Raleigh raised an eyebrow. The Duke's generosity extends to financing your annulment, does it? I have my own funds, Eleanor said, which was true enough. Her work in London had already brought in more money than a year of business in Dover. Name your price for swift, discreet service. They negotiated briefly, settling on a sum that would strain Eleanor's resources but not exhaust them. As she rose to leave, Raleigh offered one final observation. You know, Mrs. Jameson, your husband always spoke of you as a delicate, biddable creature, the kind of woman who needed a man's guidance in all things. I must say, he seems to have misjudged you rather severely. Eleanor smiled thinly. Michael saw what he expected to see, Mr. Raleigh. Most men do. As she left the offices, Eleanor felt lighter than she had in years, as though a burden she had carried for so long she had forgotten its weight had suddenly been lifted. The knowledge of Michael's betrayal should have crushed her, and perhaps, years earlier, it would have. But now it felt like the final breaking of a chain that had bound her to a past that no longer defined her. By the time Eleanor returned to Zimmerman House, the wedding ceremony would be well underway. She had hours to herself, time to consider carefully what she would say to Nicholas when he returned. She was no longer the abandoned wife clinging to a memory, nor was she a charity case to be rescued by aristocratic benevolence. She was a woman making her own choices, forging her own path, and if that path led toward Nicholas Zimmerman, it would be because she chose him freely, not because circumstances or convention dictated it. The realization brought a sense of peace that had eluded Eleanor for years, a certainty that whatever came next, it would be on her terms, shaped by her desires rather than by the expectations of others. The wedding celebration continued well into the evening, with dinner and dancing at Penfield House keeping the aristocratic guests entertained until the small hours. Eleanor had long since retired to bed when she heard the Zimmerman household return, the sounds of carriages and voices drifting up to her window. She rose early the next morning, eager to speak with Nicholas before his ducal duties claimed his attention. To her surprise, she found him already in the breakfast room, reading correspondence while a footman discreetly refilled his coffee cup. "Good morning," she said, hesitating in the doorway. Nicholas looked up, his expression brightening visibly. "Eleanor." "Good morning. Please, join me." He gestured to the chair beside his own. "Caroline's wedding was a tremendous success, in large part thanks to your exquisite creations. The Duchess of Sutherland has already inquired about commissioning you for her daughter's coming out." "That's very kind," Eleanor replied, accepting a cup of tea from the footman. "But I'm not certain I'll still be in London when the season begins." Nicholas set down his letter, giving her his full attention. "You're planning to return to Dover?" "Perhaps," she said carefully. "Though I've been considering other possibilities as well." Before she could elaborate, the door opened to admit Lady Agatha, resplendent in a morning gown of lavender silk despite the early hour. "Good heavens, Nicholas, I didn't expect to find you vertical before noon after last night's festivities." and Mrs. Jameson, bright-eyed as always. She settled herself at the table with the air of a queen granting an audience. "Now, what were you two discussing with such serious expressions?" "Eleanor's future plans," Nicholas answered, his eyes never leaving Eleanor's face. "Ah." Lady Agatha nodded sagely. "Well, don't let me interrupt. Though I do have some thoughts on the matter, should they be of interest." Eleanor couldn't help but smile at the elderly lady's transparent attempt to insert herself into the conversation. "I would value your perspective, Lady Agatha. In fact, I was about to tell Nicholas that I visited Mr. Raleigh yesterday." Nicholas stiffened. "Alone?" "Eleanor, that man is not to be trusted." "Which is precisely why I dealt with him personally," she replied calmly. "I needed to understand exactly what happened to Michael and what options are available to me now." "And what did you discover?" Lady Agatha asked, buttering a piece of toast with delicate precision. "That my husband has built a new life in Barbados, complete with a new name, a new wife, and apparently no intention of ever returning to England." Eleanor kept her voice steady, determined to show that she had moved beyond the pain of this betrayal. "I've engaged Mr. Raleigh to secure documentation of these facts, which I intend to use to petition for an annulment." Nicholas set down his coffee cup with excessive care. "An annulment," he repeated, his voice carefully neutral. "You're certain that's what you want?" "I'm certain I want the freedom to choose my own future," Eleanor answered, meeting his gaze directly. "For 5 years, I've been neither wife nor widow, trapped in a limbo not of my own making. I won't continue living that way, not now that I know the truth." "A sensible decision," Lady Agatha declared, apparently oblivious to the tension between the other two. "And what will you do with this freedom once you've secured it? Return to your shop in Dover?" Eleanor hesitated, gathering her courage. "That depends," she said quietly, "on what alternatives might be available to me." Nicholas's expression sharpened, hope and wariness battling in his features. "What alternatives are you considering, Eleanor?" Before she could respond, a footman entered with a silver salver bearing a letter. "An urgent message for His Grace," the servant announced, presenting it to Nicholas. With a barely concealed flash of irritation, Nicholas broke the seal and scanned the contents. His expression darkened as he read. "Is something wrong?" Eleanor asked, concerned by the sudden tension in his posture. "It's from my solicitor," Nicholas replied, folding the letter carefully. "It seems Mr. Raleigh has been busy. He's placed a notice in the morning papers announcing the miraculous survival of Michael Jameson and hinting at aristocratic interference in informing his wife of the fact." "What?" Eleanor gasped. "But I never authorized any such announcement." "Of course you didn't," Nicholas said grimly. "Raleigh is playing his own game. By making this public, he ensures that I can't simply make him disappear with a payment. Now the story will be the talk of London by lunchtime." Lady Agatha snorted delicately. "Clever, if despicable. The man knows that Nicholas would pay a fortune to protect both your reputations from scandal." "I'll handle Raleigh," Nicholas said, his voice cold with controlled anger. "But Eleanor, you should be prepared. Your name will be on every gossip's lips by nightfall." The thought should have terrified her. Public scandal was a woman's worst nightmare in their society. Yet Eleanor found herself strangely calm, perhaps because she had already survived the worst that could happen to her: abandonment, near destitution, years of uncertainty. What were a few weeks of gossip compared to that? "Let them talk," she said with a conviction that surprised even herself. "I've done nothing wrong. I believed my husband dead until very recently. My conscience is clear." "Yes, but," Nicholas began, only to be cut off by Lady Agatha. "The girl is right, Nicholas. There's no scandal in being the victim of a husband's desertion. If anything, society will sympathize with her plight, especially when it becomes known that the scoundrel remarried without the courtesy of ensuring his first wife was properly provided for. And what of the Duke of Westmoreland's involvement? Nicholas countered. Raleigh's notice clearly implies that I deliberately kept Eleanor in ignorance of her husband's survival for my own purposes. Did you? Lady Agatha asked bluntly. Nicholas's jaw tightened. Not entirely. I had suspicions, not confirmation. I was investigating those suspicions when Raleigh appeared. Then say so, Eleanor suggested. The truth, plainly stated, is always more powerful than gossip and innuendo. You had reason to believe my husband dead. When evidence suggested otherwise, you began an investigation. There's nothing dishonorable in that. Nicholas studied her with a mixture of admiration and concern. You're remarkably composed for someone facing public scrutiny, Eleanor. I've had 5 years to develop a thick skin, she replied with a small smile. Besides, this changes nothing about my intentions. I still plan to seek an annulment as soon as I have the necessary documentation. And after that? Nicholas asked, the question weighted with unspoken implications. Eleanor met his gaze steadily. After that, I would like to consider a future that includes you, Nicholas, if that's still something you desire. The admission, made in the presence of Lady Agatha, was as close to a declaration as propriety allowed. Nicholas's expression transformed, the tension easing from his features as hope replaced uncertainty. It is, he said simply. It has been since the day we met. Lady Agatha cleared her throat pointedly. Well, this is all very touching, but perhaps we should focus on the immediate challenge. Namely, how to respond to Mr. Raleigh's little gambit without allowing him to dictate the narrative. Nicholas nodded, his mind clearly shifting to strategic considerations. We'll issue our own statement to the papers. Straightforward, factual, emphasizing that Eleanor is the wronged party in all of this. And I'll have my solicitor begin the annulment proceedings immediately. The faster we move, the less opportunity Raleigh has to cause mischief. And in the meantime? Eleanor asked, suddenly uncertain about her position in the household given the public attention now focused on them. In the meantime, Nicholas said firmly, you continue your work here as planned. Lady Caroline's wedding has established your reputation as a milliner of exceptional talent. You have commissions to fulfill, and a future to plan. He reached across the table to cover her hand with his own. We will weather this together, Eleanor. I promise you that. The simple gesture, more than his words, reassured Eleanor that she was not facing this new challenge alone. Whatever came next, public scrutiny, legal battles, the long process of reinventing herself once again, she would have Nicholas beside her, not as a protector or savior, but as a partner who saw her strength and valued her independence. For a woman who had spent 5 years adrift, that certainty was more precious than all the security Michael had ever promised. The weeks that followed Raleigh's public revelation were as difficult as Nicholas had predicted. London society buzzed with the scandalous tale of the merchant who had faked his death, the wife who had unknowingly committed bigamy, and the Duke who had inserted himself into the affair. Versions of the story circulated in drawing rooms and gentlemen's clubs, growing more outlandish with each retelling. Some cast Eleanor as a fortune hunter who had abandoned her husband rather than the reverse, others suggested the Duke had spirited her away from Dover as his mistress under the guise of patronage. Through it all, Eleanor maintained a dignity that gradually won over even the most skeptical observers. She continued her work, creating hats for the ladies who were more intrigued than scandalized by her story. With each commission fulfilled, each social encounter navigated with grace, she established herself not as a victim of circumstance but as a woman of substance and talent. Nicholas, true to his word, stood beside her without attempting to shield her from the storm. He made no public declarations beyond confirming that he had assisted Mrs. Jameson after learning of her husband's debts, as a matter of honor following Michael Jameson's past service to him. The restraint cost him visibly. Eleanor often caught flashes of barely contained anger when particularly vicious rumors reached his ears, but he respected her wish to fight her own battles. Lady Agatha proved an unexpected ally, using her considerable social influence to ensure that Eleanor was not excluded from events where her work was being displayed. The elderly lady's stamp of approval carried weight even among those who might otherwise have shunned the association. 8 weeks after Raleigh's announcement, Eleanor received a package from Barbados containing exactly what she had requested: sworn affidavits confirming Michael Jameson's survival, his assumption of a new identity as Michael James, and his marriage to a widow named Charlotte Devereux in 1848. The documentation was accompanied by a terse note from Raleigh indicating that he considered their agreement fulfilled. "He must have sent someone ahead of his own journey," Nicholas observed when Eleanor showed him the papers. "This arrived sooner than expected." "Perhaps he's eager to be done with the matter," Eleanor suggested. "His announcement caused a sensation, but the Tun's attention span is notoriously short. The scandal is already fading." They were seated in the library, which had become their habit in the evenings after dinner. Lady Agatha, claiming fatigue, had retired early, though Eleanor suspected the elderly lady was simply giving them privacy for conversations that grew increasingly personal as the legal process of securing Eleanor's freedom progressed. "What will you do now?" Nicholas asked, setting the documents aside. "My solicitor believes the annulment could be granted within weeks, given the clear evidence of bigamy." Eleanor rose from her chair, moving to stand by the window that overlooked the garden. The August evening was warm, golden light lingering in the sky even at this late hour. "I've been considering my options," she said carefully. "My business in Dover has prospered under Sarah's management, but I'm not certain I want to return there permanently. There are too many memories, too many years spent waiting for a man who never intended to come back." Nicholas joined her at the window, close enough that she could feel the warmth of his presence without actually touching. "And your work here in London? The Duchess of Sutherland isn't the only one eager to secure your services for the coming season." "I've thought about that too," Eleanor admitted. "Perhaps a shop in London, something modest to start with. I have enough saved from these past months to secure a small establishment." "You could have that," Nicholas agreed. "You've proven your talent beyond any doubt. You could build a successful business here, independent of any connection to me or my family." Eleanor turned to face him, struck by the careful neutrality of his tone. "Is that what you think I should do?" "What I think doesn't matter," he replied, meeting her gaze directly. "What matters is what you want, Eleanor. Whatever you choose, I'll support your decision." The answer was both exactly right and somehow disappointing. Eleanor had come to value Nicholas's honesty, his willingness to share his thoughts rather than simply telling her what he believed she wanted to hear. "I'm asking what you want, Nicholas," she said quietly. "Not what you'll accept or support. What do you want for us?" The directness of the question seemed to catch him off guard. For a moment, the carefully maintained reserve he showed the world slipped, revealing the depth of feeling beneath. "I want you as my wife," he said simply. "I want to build a life with you, to face whatever challenges come our way together. I want to wake beside you each morning and fall asleep with you each night. I want children who have your courage and determination. I want decades of conversations like this one, where you demand honesty and I try to give it, even when it terrifies me." He paused, a hint of vulnerability entering his expression. "But more than anything, I want you to choose freely, without pressure or obligation. I've seen what happens when a woman's choices are constrained by circumstance or society's expectations. I won't be the cause of that for you, Eleanor. The words, spoken with such raw honesty, moved Eleanor deeply. This was so far from the calculated courtships of the ton, the marriages arranged for advantage rather than affection. Nicholas was offering her not just his name and position, but a partnership based on mutual respect, a chance to be truly seen and valued for exactly who she was. What if what I want aligns perfectly with what you want? She asked, allowing herself to step closer to him. What if I choose you, not out of necessity or gratitude, but because I've come to love the man you are, honorable, sometimes frustratingly so, but also kind and thoughtful and willing to learn from mistakes? Hope blazed in Nicholas's eyes, but he remained motionless, as though afraid any movement might shatter the moment. Is that what you're saying, Eleanor? That you could love me? Not could, she corrected gently. Do. I love you, Nicholas Zimmerman. Not because you rescued me from financial ruin or gave me opportunities one wouldn't otherwise have had. I love you because when I was angry with you, you listened. Because when I needed space, you gave it without question. Because you see me, truly see me, as I am, not as some idealized version of womanhood. Nicholas reached for her then, his hands gently framing her face as though she were something infinitely precious. Eleanor, he breathed, her name a prayer on his lips. When he kissed her, it was with a tenderness that belied the strength she knew he possessed, a gentle claiming that asked rather than demanded, that offered as much as it took. Eleanor responded with a passion that surprised them both, years of carefully controlled emotions finally finding release in his embrace. When they finally parted, breathless and flushed, Nicholas rested his forehead against hers, his voice rough with emotion. Marry me, Eleanor. Not today, not while legal matters are still unsettled, but as soon as you're free. Marry me because you want to, not because it's expected or convenient. Eleanor smiled, her heart lighter than it had been in years. Yes, she said simply. Yes, I'll marry you, Nicholas. Because I choose you, freely and with my whole heart. Outside the library window, London continued its evening rhythms, oblivious to the moment of transformation occurring within Zimmerman House. But for Eleanor Jameson, the world had shifted fundamentally, not because of external circumstance, but because she had finally claimed the right to determine her own destiny, to love and be loved on her own terms. The path that had begun with abandonment had led, through grief and struggle and unexpected kindness, to something she had never thought to find again, not just love, but a love built on truth, on seeing and being seen, on choosing and being chosen in return. It was, Eleanor reflected as Nicholas's arms encircled her once more, everything she had never dared to hope for, and all the more precious for having been found when she had ceased to expect happiness at all. 6 months later, on a crisp winter morning, Eleanor stood before the altar of St. George's, Hanover Square, her hand resting in Nicholas's as the Archbishop of Canterbury pronounced them husband and wife. The church was filled with a curious mixture of aristocrats and tradespeople, Nicholas's social circle alongside the shop assistants, seamstresses, and clients who had become Eleanor's extended family during her transformation from abandoned wife to celebrated milliner to duchess. Her elegant ivory gown, designed by the finest modiste in London, was complemented by a bonnet of her own creation, a confection of silk and lace that managed to be both fashionable and uniquely personal, much like the woman who wore it. As they emerged from the church to the cheers of well-wishers and the curious gazes of passers-by, Eleanor reflected on the journey that had brought her to this moment. The annulment of her marriage to Michael had been granted swiftly, the evidence of his bigamy leaving the courts no choice but to declare the union void. The scandal had faded as quickly as Lady Agatha had predicted, replaced by new gossip about Eleanor's courtship by the Duke of Westmoreland, a romance that society found far more entertaining than the sordid tale of abandonment that had preceded it. Eleanor had closed her shop in Dover, transferring ownership to Sarah, who had proven herself more than capable of maintaining the business. In London, with Nicholas's encouragement, she had established a small but exclusive millinery catering to discerning clients who valued artistry over slavish adherence to fashion. The venture was already profitable, though Eleanor knew that as a duchess, she would now be expected to focus on charitable endeavors rather than trade. But Nicholas, true to his word, had placed no restrictions on her continued work. "Your talent is part of who you are," he had told her when she raised the subject. "I would never ask you to diminish yourself to fit society's narrow view of a duchess's role." As they settled into the carriage that would carry them to their wedding breakfast, Nicholas took Eleanor's gloved hand in his. "Happy, my love?" he asked, his eyes searching hers. Eleanor smiled, the expression reaching all the way to her eyes, something that would have been unimaginable during those years of waiting in Dover. "More than I ever thought possible," she answered honestly. "Though I must confess, I'm still adjusting to the idea of being a duchess." Nicholas laughed, the sound rich and warm in the intimate space of the carriage. "You'll be a magnificent duchess, Eleanor, unconventional, perhaps, but that's precisely what drew me to you. You've never been bound by others' expectations. A quality I've only recently learned to embrace," she acknowledged. "For years, I defined myself by Michael's abandonment, the woman left behind, the faithful wife maintaining appearances despite all evidence that my husband wasn't coming back. It took